America this week refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It broke with its allies and voted with Russia, Belarus and North Korea, all authoritarian governments. How big is the geopolitical earthquake that we are living through now, do you think?
We're in incredibly disruptive times. Apparently, this is the first time since the 1940s something like this has happened with a US vote at the UN. So it's a seismic shift. Now, whether this is the US in 4 years' time, who knows? But for now, there's a tremendous amount of churn in its policy positioning, which the world is noticing, not least in the cuts to its development aid, its withdrawal from international organisations, and its new friendship with Russia.
And a lot of this is playing out against the backdrop of attempts to stop the fighting between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, you were at the Munich Security Conference recently. Just looking at the conference website commentary, it was saying that European leaders felt that, quote, America is turning its back on Europe. Is that your view?
Europe was shell-shocked by what happened in the days leading up to Munich as well as at Munich. In the days leading up, the new Defence Secretary, Mr. Hegseth, went to Brussels and there pretty much said, don't rely on America for Ukraine or for anything else much, which raises the question of what is the point of NATO if it's not about the US underwriting European security as it has in the past. Europe's historical perspective on this, the Americans were vital on the Allied side coming in late in World War I. They broke a stalemate in that war. They were vital in turning the tide against fascism in Italy and in Germany. So Europe has had the best part of more than a century seeing America coming in as critical to its security, and that security blanket has been withdrawn. Hence the huge concern in Europe about the statements. Then at the Munich conference, people expected a security type speech from the Vice President, J.D. Vance, and instead got a lecture about letting the far right be fully included in governments and the rest of it. So very traumatised Europe when I was there.
So when you mesh those two things together that you've touched on, you can see a Donald Trump who sees the EU as an adversary on trade, and actually said this week that the idea of the European Union was set up to screw the United States, in his terminology. And they've done a good job of it, he said. And you mesh that together with what J.D. Vance is saying about his culture war, effectively. Does it look like the Trump administration is trying to destroy the European Union?
Well, some are saying exactly that. And that, of course, also plays to a Russian agenda, which would rather like to see bits of it peeled off. Russia has its friends within the European Union, most notably Hungary and now Slovakia as well. So destabilising Europe is very much their playbook, and it looks like President Trump is playing into that. I think now that he has the tech oligarchs in the States so close to him, the message from them will be that the Europeans are trying to regulate their ability to do whatever they like, however they like, whenever they like. And so he's going into bat for US tech business and having minimal, if any, regulation.
Because the EU has more strident rules on AI and on social media platforms, you mean?
Yes, the EU has upheld the right to privacy. When you're going into a Google search, for example, when you're in Europe, you always have more sort of consents to give. Are you sure you want to, allow this to happen, and so on. So they have tried to give more protection than you would get in the US or indeed here.
You touched on NATO just before, saying, it raises the question of what's the point of NATO. Do you think that NATO is under threat as an alliance?
Yes, I do, because it's no longer clear what the US would do as part of its NATO responsibilities. And that's why President Macron, the day after the Munich Security Conference, summoned a group of European leaders, not all, to Paris to talk about the way forward, and then had a further conversation with a wider group later in the week. It very much looks like there will be the development of some parallel body to NATO, which doesn't have the US in it, where Europe will step up on its own defence. Now, as I've said, Europe proved unable to defend itself from aggression on 2 occasions in the 20th century, but we're in the 21st century, warfare's changed, modern technology, they probably could do it, but it is costly. Ursula von der Leyen came to the Munich conference and said, you know, Europe's going to step up on defence. Some will, some won't. But one way or another, they are looking to future security, knowing that the US cannot be relied on.
So we're seeing the sun set on NATO, in your view?
We are seeing the sun set on an alliance where it was more or less guaranteed that the US would step in if a NATO member was under threat. I don't think that can any longer be taken for granted.
And how big a deal is that in your view?
It's a huge deal. It's rewriting really the post-war settlement, where US as the victors, Europe was on its knees, the US came to the party with NATO, the Cold War set in, the US was always there as that security blanket. And that is now very much in question.
And it hasn't just been a one-way street, has it? I mean, Article 5.1 that you referred to, which, you know, attack on one is an attack on all. Wasn't that the only time it was ever invoked was when America was attacked in 9/11?
Pretty much, yes. And then, you know, European nations around the world came to help one way or another with Afghanistan, which eventually ended in tears as well as a result of actions taken through the Trump presidency. But no, we are in tumultuous times where the old certainties have been thrown aside.
Alex Younger, who used to be the boss of MI6, said this week, we are in a new era where international relations are not going to be determined by rules and multilateral institutions, but by strong men and deals. Would you agree with that sentiment? Is that the path we're going down?
It's terrifying, isn't it? Because here we are, a small country, relying on international law and the set of institutions which were set up to keep that in place and keep international cooperation in place. So you move to a world where, you know, President Putin, President Trump and President Xi call the shots. It's not the sort of world most of us would want to live in. We want to see something more inclusive, something more based on international law, upholding human rights, being good for trade, being good for development, and all that is being cast aside in this new strongman scenario.
We talked about the potential of an alternative to NATO if the US can't continue buying into that. I mean, Europe is reacting by urgently increasing defence spending, or promising to. I see Keir Starmer talking about raising spending to 3% of GDP by the early 2030s. Are we in a new global arms race now?
Well, on the current settings, yes. And that's when you have to pinch yourself and say, hang on a minute, aren't there other ways? And you start to think back to the choreography around the Cold War. Well, you had 2 nuclear-armed camps, but they never went to war because there were rules of engagement that were observed. Now, I think we need to see how the Ukraine conflict plays out. One way or another, I think it's going to end. But then the serious conversation that Europe has to have with Russia is, what are the rules of engagement going forward? Because otherwise, everyone arms themselves to the teeth at huge cost to the services and supports they can provide their domestic populations, let alone the bloodbath now in international development spending. And frankly, if the British were to take their defence spending to 3%. They're not going to be able to do that by raiding just the development budget. You're going to be raiding the NHS, you're going to be raiding education, all sorts of things. So at some point the reality has to sink in that a new arms race isn't going to take us anywhere except towards misery, and we need to find some new European security architecture with some rules around it.
You touched on where the British defence spending is going to come from. And in fact, you're right, they're going to cut overseas aid to fund it, and we've seen America gutting US aid Do you worry that a world where poverty isn't addressed is a more dangerous world, and that this could actually be more counterproductive?
More dangerous world, a sicker world, because we won't be on top of the disease outbreaks. And it's not just the US and the UK that are cutting. Germany's announcing cuts. The Japanese, the Dutch, the Belgians, the French, the Italians haven't given much anyway. All the heavy hitters are cutting.
And you will know the consequences of that. You ran the UNDP.
Yep.
This is core business.
This is core business. So firstly, the biggest call on international development aid at the moment is the humanitarian spend. People who are literally starving, they're in conflict zones, they don't have access to the basics of life. Without that humanitarian dollar, people die. Children are unvaccinated, etc. There's also a lot of concern, if you take the health aspects of US policy now, combined with the aid cuts, that we're not going to have surveillance over emerging disease threats, and that we're at more risk of another pandemic than we would otherwise be. So these cuts have very grave implications.
Countries seem to think that they don't have much options other than rushing into this increase in defence spending. I see our own Prime Minister in New Zealand suggesting that we could aim for 2% of GDP, which would be a big increase for us, something around 10 billion. Is that a good idea?
Well, I don't think so. And frankly, notwithstanding the presence of 3 Chinese vessels in the Tasman Sea, we're not under a threat of invasion. 3 ships isn't exactly the Spanish Armada in the English Channel. It's a tit for tat. New Zealand cheerfully sails through the Taiwan Strait with a tanker behind an Australian vessel. Now the Chinese come down and sail through our backyard in the Tasman Sea. Now the Prime Minister says he wants to send a frigate up to the South China Sea. I mean, why are we buying into this fight? I think we need to focus a lot more on the security and stability and economic viability of our South Pacific neighbours, who are clearly lured by the prospect of relationships with China at this time. We're letting some of the basics go if we start to focus on building up our own military capacity, which will always be minuscule and not frighten off anyone.
There will be calls on it. There were when you were Prime Minister. There's already been talk about sending peacekeepers to Ukraine. I mean, surely New Zealand does need to invest in defence, but you just don't think to that level.
I think it's the hardware that's really costly. But New Zealand SAS, there's always going to be a role for at home and abroad. New Zealand engineers always greatly favoured. New Zealand peacekeepers generally, we've done a great job in the multinational force in the Sinai for decades now with the peace between Egypt and Israel. We've had a credible presence in Bosnia-Herzegovina. We've done a lot of great things, and we should continue to do those things. This is pretty much the way the Irish Army focuses on peacekeeping contributions of those kinds.
You restructured the Defence Force in the early 2000s, and you uttered the phrase that we lived in a benign strategic environment. I see that's come back from your critics to if not to haunt you, that at least people are putting that back on you now. Do you regret, say, disestablishing the strike wing, for example? Would that be any good to us in this world?
In 35 years, those Skyhawks had fired one shot over the bow of a fishing boat. So you've got to say, for return on investment, we weren't getting much. So not a moment's regret about it. Now, if people are going to argue for strike wings of the Air Force and more aggressive naval capacity, let's be clear, this would not be about the defence of New Zealand. This would be about New Zealand plugging in to bigger allied forces. And New Zealand had, by and large, got itself off that bandwagon. We had the defence relationship with Australia, which was active and a lot of interoperability and exercising, but we were off the bandwagon of US adventures. And I would be a strong advocate for not getting back on that bandwagon.
We are obviously in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement. Do you think that will come into question or threat or change under this Trump administration?
Well, it might. There's been some talk in the media of Trump wanting to evict Canada from it. Please could we follow? I mean, really. The problem with Five Eyes now is that it has become a basis for policy positioning on all sorts of things. You will recall that in my time as Prime Minister, and all the time leading up to that, it was never acknowledged that it even existed. It was an intelligence sharing pool. It was never confirmed or denied that it was even there. And to see it now as the basis for joint statements, finance ministers' meetings, this has got a bit out of control.
You were a Prime Minister who took the ministerial portfolio of being in charge of the SIS, so you will know this intimately, but are you suggesting that New Zealand should not be in Five Eyes anymore?
I think it was useful for New Zealand, but it was useful, but I'm going to qualify that by saying that intelligence generally comes with interpretation. And you will recall the interpretations which led to the US and UK, with Australian support, invading Iraq. We questioned that intelligence and never acted on it. So intelligence has to be treated with scepticism because you can get 2 and 2 makes 17, as in the case that led up to Iraq being invaded.
I'm just trying to get it clear in my mind where you sit on this. Are you saying that Five Eyes is not now vital to New Zealand's interests?
I'm saying that it's useful if it goes back to being a quiet, not particularly acknowledged intelligence sharing pool. Where it's not helpful is as a coordination of foreign policy positioning. And that's where it's headed.
I mean, if you've got Tulsi Gabbard, who's a Director of National Intelligence, who is seen by some critics as a pro-Kremlin stance, or having a pro-Kremlin stance, would New Zealand be comfortable sharing intelligence into that administration?
Not in its right mind, no, because you don't know where it's going to go, and the point of the Five Eyes was it was pretty tight. New Zealand didn't leak what it had, nobody did, but in the current circumstances you could not guarantee that.
What about New Zealand's nuclear-free status in this geopolitical repositioning? I mean, like, this might sound like a jest question, but do you think Trump knows that his nuclear-powered vessels can't come into New Zealand waters, and what happens if he does find out?
If he does find out, maybe we'll get tariffs trebled on beef or something. It's very, very transactional. But no, I suspect it's not even on his radar. But I think at times like these, hang on to the old principles. We acted out of principle because of concern about the impact of nuclear war. This is the 80th anniversary year of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Anyone who's visited there knows what that does to people. Our South Pacific neighbourhood is very keen on nuclear-free zones, and I would not for a moment be in support of putting it aside.
You've been quite publicly involved in saying that New Zealand shouldn't join Pillar 2 of AUKUS. Does any of this positioning or volatility change that?
So what will happen to AUKUS under the Trump administration? Isn't it even less likely that Australia will get its submarines? There's a different debate in Australia. There's concern that for the first time since the 1960s, they won't have their own submarine capacity, but we'll end up with a couple of American bases with the Americans station their own. So it's a huge issue for them. But again, I see AUKUS Pillar 2 as really an attempt to drag New Zealand back into an operational defence alliance with the United States, which was something we were extracted from in the mid-1980s, and I don't see a case for going back to it.
China is deeply opposed to us joining and has warned us publicly about repercussions. Is that a factor that New Zealand should be taking into account, or should it be making this decision on its own national interests?
Well, make its decision on its own national interests, but I think the national interests are in the positioning that we had for a rather long time of being a small liberal democracy with a sort of whānau of countries who had the same sets of interests and values. And you have to put a question mark over the US in that respect now too, with the assault on the Constitution and many of the established truths we thought there were about how American democracy worked. But then we also had to make our way in the world, and the reality is that you're going to be a very poor country if you only trade with the ones who agree with you. So yes, we have the big trade agreement with China and others that our political system's not necessarily very, very close to. And we need to keep that positioning, that we have our values and our principles, or we will state them, but we also have to earn a living.
We've seen the presence of these Chinese vessels in the Tasman. How concerned should New Zealand be about that? Yes, we went through Strait of Taiwan, but we weren't doing live firing exercises. I mean, it seems to be at a level that perhaps they're trying to send a message.
I think the live firing was completely over the top, and there was no notice of it. Who knows whether the order came down from Beijing to go down and fire a few shots and rack up the Australians and New Zealanders, or whether naval command somewhere thought it would be a good idea. Who knows? It shouldn't have happened, and Winston Peters was absolutely right to raise it in Beijing, that we would expect at least the courtesy of knowing that this was going to happen. You can't stop the Chinese or anybody sailing through the Tasman Sea, but you would expect some courtesies.
And this deal that they have signed with the Cooks, which does seem to include the ability to build infrastructure like ports in the islands, I mean, could that lead to China developing a strategic presence in the Cooks?
At a stretch, yes, and this is why it's a huge concern to New Zealand. The Cooks is not just any South Pacific state. Like Niue and like the Tokelau's, it has a particular status with respect to New Zealand. Unlike Samoa, it never opted for independence. Samoa couldn't wait to get out from under the New Zealand wing. We were not nice to Samoa, and I made an apology with respect to historical injustice on that when I was Prime Minister. But Cook's, Niue, Tokelau never went. They kept New Zealand citizenship, they kept the passports, and a special relationship, which does require consultation on significant foreign policy and security issues. That did not happen. And the Cooks have signed up to a relationship where they agree to support Chinese candidates in international organisation elections. Certainly no New Zealand partnership agreements ever agreed to that. They have in effect opened the way for seabed minerals exploration and future exploitation, which has obviously huge question marks around it for the marine ecosystem of the Cooks. There are a lot of fishhooks in what we have already seen from that agreement, and I think the Cook Islands government is right out of court on it. Again, Winston Peters had to go to Beijing and raise this.
But in terms of what this means for New Zealand, we might see a lot more vessels from China in our neighbourhood if they are building ships and building wharves and ports in the Cook Islands.
Yeah, we may well. So the question is now what to do with the Cook Islands relationship, and the Foreign Minister has called for a reset. The last reset really was the 2001 Joint Centenary Declaration, which from the Cook's point of view is more observed in the breach. So something has to be done.
Is China a threat to New Zealand?
I don't think it's a physical threat to New Zealand. As I say, 3 ships isn't exactly an invading force. But the reality is there are a lot of cyber attacks. And let's not be so naive as to think they're all one way. A lot of countries have capacity, offensive cyber capacity, and there's no rules around that at all.
So New Zealand would be doing that to China too?
I doubt we've got that capacity, but certainly, people New Zealand associates with have. So, those with high capacity intelligence systems know a lot about what others are doing, and even when I was PM, there were many attempts to penetrate, say, the electricity grid or other systems and so on. So
from China?
Well, who knows who they were from, but what I know is you do have to invest heavily in your cyber security. I'm not interested in New Zealand going down an offensive capacity route, but you have to have your systems secure.
What are China's ambitions in the Pacific, do you think? What are they up to here?
So just as the US asserted primacy over the West Pacific for decades, no doubt China wants primacy over the West Pacific. And unlike the US, it's geographically located there, so it's got a stake. In that sense, it's not a bad thing for the US to continue to keep an interest in the West Pacific. But the view of Professor Hugh White when he came and did the lectures last year was the US was not conceivably likely to spend enough to keep that kind of primacy, which would be contested by China. So the US needed to be thinking about what its future positioning in the West Pacific was, where it wanted to draw its lines, put its stake. And I think that's not really a conversation that New Zealand's picked up on at the moment. Where do we see this future with these two great powers, both with an interest in the region? Shouldn't we be associating ourselves more with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which have managed to deftly position between the two for a long time? And just be a little cautious about where we position ourselves.
If we could finish with Donald Trump. Have you met him?
No. I was leaving UNDP as he became president. I followed with great interest Jacinda Ardern's meeting with him on the margin of the UN, which went as well as it could have at the time. But no, I haven't met him.
Do you think he represents a danger to the world order?
Well, he's disrupted the world order, with respect to what he's done to USAID and also other areas of aid, what's going to happen to PEPFAR, other funds set up by George W. Bush to fight TB, AIDS and malaria, what about the State Department aid funding, etc., etc. This is disastrous. Look, if Trump could contribute to bringing an end to the war in Ukraine sooner rather than later, on a basis that does not humiliate Ukraine, good on him. The agony there, and the agony for protagonists on both sides is great. Obviously very worried about Gaza. The Riviera of the Mediterranean without the Gazans' presence is just not acceptable at all. So we're in a time of enormous uncertainty, and it's almost as if President Trump often throws ideas out there to see how they'll bounce, and then maybe they never happened. He was reported today when a reporter said to him that he'd called President Zelensky a dictator. Did I say that? Really? He'd moved on from it. So I think you can take some stuff with a bit of a grain of salt, but it's disruptive, and we don't know when he's serious and when he's not.
You've dealt with American presidents who were in fairly belligerent moods. After 9/11, we had the George W. Bush saying you're either with us or against us, and then there was a lot of pressure for New Zealand to go into Iraq in 2003, which you resisted. How do we stand up to Trump, or do we keep our heads down? What do you think?
Yeah, I think for New Zealand, certainly it shouldn't be reacting to every statement President Trump makes, because you'd never speak about anything else. But there are things where you need to stand up on principle, and I think support for the International Criminal Court is one of those. The American administration has slapped wide sanctions on anyone who has anything to do with them, and we have always supported that court from the time Paul East was a key mover in getting it established. So we need to pick our battles, as it were, and try to keep a level of civility of discourse. I think watching the top European leaders there this week, President Macron and then Keir Starmer, really class acts of engaging while drawing lines. I think that's where we need to be.
That's the lesson for New Zealand too?
Yeah. Engage but draw lines.